At a crowded supermarket in Charlotte, a young black man uses the money he has spent the past 18 months saving to buy supplies for the cafe he has always dreamed of opening. Just as he is about to pay, he hears an elderly veteran struggling to afford his medication. The man doesn't beg, doesn't ask for help, he simply accepts his fate in silence. The young man should walk away and focus on his dream. But instead, he chooses to do something no one else in that store dares to do: help the man. What he doesn't realize is that this act of kindness is about to change his life forever. The overhead lights cast a sterile glow over the supermarket aisles, reflecting off the polished tile floors as Cameron Bennett maneuvered his cart with careful precision. The air smelled faintly of freshly brewed coffee from the store's cafe section, mixing with the subtle sweetness of bakery goods. It reminded him of what he was working toward: his own little coffee and pastry cart, a dream that had taken 18 long months of grinding to bring to life. His fingers gripped the slightly worn edges of his handwritten shopping list, his neat, slanted handwriting outlining each item in careful order. Every ingredient, every supply had been meticulously planned out, budgeted down to the cent. This wasn't just a casual grocery run, it was the first step toward something bigger. He glanced down at the cart, double-checking his selections: flour, sugar, butter, yeast essentials for baking. A bulk bag of espresso beans, one of his biggest expenses, but non-negotiable. He had gone back and forth on the brand, finally settling on a mid-tier option not too expensive, but good enough to make the kind of rich, bold coffee people would come back for. Disposable coffee cups, lids, sleeves, filters. He had even factored in the cost of branding, considering custom stickers for the cups, but that would have to wait. Right now, every dollar counted. He paused, his dark eyes scanning the price tags as he mentally recalculated. $980. Just enough left for one last item: wax paper, something simple but necessary to wrap the pastries. His cart was nearly full, the culmination of over a year of careful saving, long shifts and late nights spent dreaming about the moment he would finally launch his business. For a brief second he allowed himself to imagine it: the early mornings, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air, the warmth of a cinnamon roll in someone's hands as they rushed to work. He had spent countless hours perfecting his recipes, adjusting ingredients, testing different brewing techniques. It wasn't just about selling coffee and pastries. It was about creating something of his own, something that belonged to him. Something that, maybe, just maybe, could turn into something bigger. His parents had worked too hard, sacrificed too much for him to settle for just getting by. His father came home from the steel mill each evening, exhausted, his hands calloused from years of labor. His mother spent her nights cleaning classrooms, her back aching from bending and scrubbing for hours. They had given him what little they could: not much, but enough to help him start. Enough to trust that he wouldn't waste it. He wouldn't waste it. Cameron adjusted his grip on the cart and turned toward the aisle where the wax paper was stocked. One more item, and he was done. As Cameron reached for the wax paper, the rhythmic beeping of cash registers and the murmur of distant conversations filled the supermarket, blending into background noise. The air carried a mix of scents: freshly ground coffee from the store's cafe section, the faint sweetness of bakery goods, the sterile sharpness of the pharmacy counter nearby. His mind was focused, his calculations precise. He had mapped everything out perfectly: $980 spent so far, just enough room left in his budget for this last item. One final purchase, and he would be done. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly, casting a cool glow over the aisles as he scanned the shelves, eyes moving past rolls of parchment and aluminum foil until he found what he was looking for. He reached out, fingers grazing the edge of the wax paper box, when a voice broke through the ambient noise of the store. It wasn't loud, it wasn't panicked, but there was something about it, something restrained, something weighted, that made Cameron's hand still for just a second. "You're telling me this is after insurance?" The tone was measured, but beneath the calm was something else: frustration, resignation. Cameron wasn't the type to eavesdrop, but the voice came from just a few feet away, near the pharmacy counter at the end of the aisle. He didn't mean to turn his head, but he did just slightly, just enough for his eyes to land on the man speaking. The stranger stood with his back straight, shoulders squared in a way that suggested years of discipline. His hair, gray at the edges, was cropped short in military fashion. He wore a faded army jacket, the kind that had seen years of wear, the stitching frayed at the cuffs. The insignia on his chest was slightly worn but still unmistakable. Cameron couldn't see the man's face fully, but he saw enough. The tightness in his jaw. The way his hand flexed slightly at his side before curling into a loose fist. A man used to control, to order, now faced with something outside of his power. The pharmacist, a young woman in a crisp white coat, offered him a small professional smile. "Yes, sir," she said. "This is the lowest price available after your insurance coverage." A pause. Then, slowly, the man exhaled. $1,200, he repeated, more to himself than to her. His voice was quieter this time. He rubbed the back of his neck, the movement slow and deliberate. "For 1 month." The pharmacist nodded. Cameron wasn't sure why he was still standing there. He should have just grabbed the wax paper and gone to check out. He had a plan, a budget, a future waiting to be built. This wasn't his business. But something in the man's posture, the way his fingers lingered near his pocket before he finally pulled out a worn leather wallet, held him there. The veteran flipped through the cash inside, his fingers moving slowly, deliberately. A moment later, he placed a small stack of bills on the counter. "This is all I've got," he said, his voice even. $200. The pharmacist hesitated. "I'm sorry," she said, softer this time but firm. "That's not enough." A muscle in the man's jaw twitched. Cameron could feel it now, the shift in the air. It was subtle, but real. The same kind of feeling he had learned to recognize growing up. The quiet, uneasy tension that crept in when someone was being pushed aside, dismissed, overlooked. The veteran let out a slow, measured breath before retrieving his money and tucking it back into his wallet. His hand lingered there for a second before he pulled it away. "I need this medication," he said, his voice low but steady. "Diabetes. A few other things." He let out a dry chuckle, but there was no humor in it. 25 years in the service. Spent my whole youth fighting so other people didn't have to. Another pause. Didn't think I'd end up here, choosing between my health and keeping my damn lights on. The words settled in the space between them, heavy and unmoving. No one in the store reacted. A few customers glanced over but quickly looked away. The man behind the next register shifted slightly, clearing his throat before turning his attention back to his items. A woman near the self-checkout lanes glanced up, her gaze lingering for only a second before she turned away, uninterested. Nobody moved. Nobody said anything. The veteran stood there for another moment, as if waiting, hoping, maybe that something would change, that someone would step in. No one did. Finally, he gave a small nod, the kind that came from a man swallowing disappointment. He adjusted his jacket slightly, straightening his shoulders, reclaiming whatever dignity he could. Then, without another word, he turned and began walking toward the exit. Cameron should have looked away. Should have just grabbed the wax paper, gone to the register and left. But he didn't. His fingers curled around the handle of his cart, his pulse steady but a little heavier now. His mind was screaming at him to stay focused, to remember why he was here. But his feet had already started to move. Cameron's feet moved before his brain could stop them. "Sir?" The word left his mouth before he even realized he was saying it. The veteran stopped. Slowly he turned, his sharp yet tired eyes locking onto Cameron's. There was a flicker of something: caution, curiosity, maybe even annoyance at being stopped. But he didn't speak. He just waited. Cameron hesitated for a fraction of a second, suddenly aware that he had nothing planned beyond this moment. He hadn't thought this through. He glanced toward the pharmacy counter, then back at the man in front of him. I heard what you said about the medication." The veteran studied him. His expression didn't change, but his posture did just slightly. His shoulders squared, his jaw tightening, as if preparing for some kind of lecture or judgment. "And?" he said, voice even. Cameron swallowed. "How much more do you need?" The veteran's expression flickered with something unreadable. He was silent for a beat, as if trying to gauge whether this was some kind of trick. Then, after a pause, he answered. 1,000. $1,000. Cameron felt his stomach twist. The exact amount in his pocket. The exact amount he had spent months scraping together. His entire future. For a moment he could hear his mother's voice in his head, warning him not to be careless. His father's, telling him that nobody was going to hand him anything in this world, that every dollar he earned had to be fought for. And he had fought for this. Every late-night shift, every aching muscle, every hour spent dreaming about finally having something of his own, it had all been leading to this moment. But as he looked at the veteran, really looked at him, he saw more than just an old man struggling to afford his medication. He saw someone who had given everything for others and had been left to figure it out alone. Someone who had spent years protecting a country that had seemingly forgotten about him. Cameron glanced at his cart. The neatly stacked supplies, the bulk espresso beans, the flour, the cups, the wax paper. The tightness in his chest grew. Then, without letting himself think too much, he made his decision. "Can you wait here for just a minute?" The veteran furrowed his brow, suspicious now. For what? Cameron forced a small smile, but there was something shaky underneath it. "Just trust me." The veteran studied him for another long second. Then, slowly, he gave a small nod. "All right." Cameron turned back toward the shelves. His pulse pounded in his ears. And one by one, he started placing the items back. Cameron moved through the aisles with a sense of finality, his fingers brushing over the items as he returned them to their places. The bag of espresso beans went first, its weight heavy in his hands before he set it back on the shelf. Next, the flour, sugar, and yeast, each container carefully placed back where he had found them. The disposable coffee cups, lids, and filters followed. Piece by piece, he unraveled months of planning, months of sacrifice, until his cart was empty again. His chest felt tight, but he pushed the feeling down. At the checkout counter, the cashier barely looked up as Cameron approached. A young guy, maybe a year or two younger than him, with earbuds in, tapping at the register absent-mindedly. When Cameron handed him the last remaining item, the wax paper, the cashier blinked, finally taking notice. "That all for you?" he asked, scanning it. Cameron nodded. "Yeah." Actually, he hesitated, reaching into his pocket. His fingers brushed against the smooth edges of the neatly folded bills. $1,000. The weight of 18 months of labor pressed into his palm. He let out a slow breath, then looked up. "Can I do cash back?" The cashier shrugged. "Sure, how much?" Cameron didn't flinch. $1,000. That got the kid's attention. His brows raised slightly, but he didn't question it. A moment later, the register beeped, and Cameron took the crisp 10 $100 bills into his hands. They felt unreal now, like they belonged to someone else. His stomach twisted, but he ignored it. Turning back toward the waiting area near the pharmacy, he spotted the veteran still standing there, arms crossed over his chest, eyes wary. The way he watched Cameron approach, you'd think he was expecting some kind of speech, some kind of lecture about self-reliance or financial responsibility. But Cameron didn't say anything. He simply stopped in front of the man, took a deep breath, and extended the money toward him. "Please," Cameron said, voice steady despite the way his heart pounded. "Take it." The veteran blinked, his body going rigid. "What?" Cameron pushed the cash toward him, urging him to take it. "It's yours. For the medicine." For a long moment, the veteran didn't move. His sharp eyes darted from Cameron's face to the money, then back again, as if waiting for the catch. "Kid, I can't." His voice was quieter now, like he wasn't sure how to process what was happening. "That's too much." Cameron shook his head. "No, it's not." The veteran swallowed. His hands twitched, like he wanted to take it but couldn't let himself. "This money, it's not just extra cash you had lying around, is it?" Cameron hesitated, then admitted, "I was saving to start a business." The veteran's jaw tightened. "And you're giving that up? For me?" "It's just money," Cameron said simply. "Your health is more important." A beat of silence stretched between them. Then, finally, with fingers that trembled slightly, the veteran took the money. His grip tightened around it, his knuckles pale, as if afraid it would disappear if he let go. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. "No one's ever done something like this for me before." Cameron felt a lump rise in his own throat, but he forced a small smile. "Just take care of yourself." The veteran stared at him for another long moment. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, pulled out an old flip phone from his pocket. The edges were worn, the buttons slightly faded, but the camera lens still gleamed under the fluorescent light. "Would it be all right if I took a picture?" the veteran asked softly. I want to remember this." Cameron felt his face heat up but nodded. "Yeah, of course." The veteran raised the phone and snapped a picture. He stared at the screen for a long time, his eyes glistening, before letting out a shaky breath. Then, with a quiet chuckle, he murmured, "People need to see that kindness still exists." Cameron said nothing, only offering a small smile. He hadn't done this for recognition. But what he didn't realize, what neither of them realized, was that this small act of kindness was about to change his life in ways he never expected. The moment Cameron stepped through the front door, the warmth of home wrapped around him, the familiar scent of his mother's slow-cooked stew lingering in the air, the low hum of the evening news murmuring from the old television set in the living room. The house was small, modest, but it had always been a place of safety, of comfort. Not tonight. His mother was at the kitchen counter, her back turned, wiping down the surface with slow, methodical movements. His father sat at the dining table, flipping through a stack of bills, his reading glasses perched low on his nose. The rhythmic ticking of the old wall clock filled the silence between them. Cameron barely had time to set down his keys before his mother turned, her sharp eyes locking onto him. No bags, no supplies. Nothing but a single roll of wax paper. She frowned. "Where are the groceries?" His father looked up then, his expression already clouding. The exhaustion of a long workday sat heavy in his features, the lines on his face deepening as his gaze flickered to Cameron's empty hands. Cameron's throat tightened. He had rehearsed this conversation in his head on the way home, but now, standing here, under the weight of their expectant stares, the words felt heavier than he had imagined. His mother's brow furrowed deeper as the silence stretched too long. "Cameron?" He exhaled slowly. I gave the money to someone who needed it." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the muffled voice of the news anchor on the television and the steady ticking of the clock above the kitchen sink. Then his mother blinked. "You did what?" Cameron shifted on his feet. There was a man at the store, a veteran. He couldn't afford his medication. He needed $1,000, and so I. His mother's hand slapped against the counter, hard. The sound cracked through the room like a whip. "Cameron, kondalam kaigi." Her voice rose, disbelief laced in every syllable. His father straightened in his chair, his fingers tightening around the bills in his hands. "Tell me you're joking," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Tell me you didn't just throw away everything we worked for." Cameron's jaw clenched. It wasn't throwing it away. His father's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood up, slow but deliberate. "You gave it all away? Just like that?" His voice was louder now, sharper. "He needed help," Cameron insisted. "And I had the money." His father let out a hollow laugh, one that held no amusement, only anger. "Had. You had the money." He took a step closer, his broad frame casting a shadow over Cameron. "And now? Now you have nothing. No business. No supplies. No way to start over." His mother shook her head, pressing her fingers against her temple. "Cameron, that money wasn't just yours. Chung ta de gip kon tiat kem tung shu. Tung chut mot." Her voice cracked, frustration bleeding into something else, something closer to heartbreak. "Chung tin kon. Chung ta da tin kon si kon lam diogi dai dot." Cameron's chest tightened. This wasn't dai dot. This was the right thing to do. His father scoffed, running a hand over his face. "And how do you even know he wasn't lying? You think people don't make up stories?" He pointed a finger at Cameron, his voice rising again. "You think some stranger in a grocery store deserved everything you had more than you do?" Cameron's pulse pounded. He didn't ask me for anything. He wasn't scamming me. His father's hand slammed down on the table. Then why didn't he go to the VA? Why didn't he ask for help from the people who were supposed to take care of him? Why did he just happen to be standing there, waiting for some kid like you to come along with $1,000 in his pocket? Cameron clenched his fists at his sides. Because no one else was going to help him. His father shook his head. "And now you've lost everything because you thought you could save someone. Cameron's breath came faster. Maybe I did, he shot back. But at least I did something. His father's jaw locked, his face darkening. You're a damn fool, he muttered under his breath, before shaking his head and turning away. I need some air. Without another word, he grabbed his jacket from the chair and walked out, the door slamming shut behind him. Cameron's mother stood frozen in place, one hand gripping the counter, her shoulders tense. Slowly she exhaled, pressing her fingers to her lips as if trying to steady herself. Then, without looking at him, she shook her head. I don't even know what to say to you right now, she murmured, voice tight with disappointment. Her words cut deeper than his father's anger ever could. And just like that, the conversation was over. Cameron stood in the middle of the kitchen, his hands still trembling, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had known they wouldn't understand. But he hadn't expected it to hurt this much. The silence in the Bennett household had been suffocating for 2 days. Cameron barely spoke. His mother barely looked at him. His father had only said a handful of words since their argument, most of them clipped cold and distant. Every time Cameron stepped into a room, the air seemed to thicken, weighed down by the disappointment hanging over him like a storm cloud that refused to break. He didn't regret what he had done. But the aftermath sat heavy in his chest, pressing against his ribs every time he caught his mother's wary glance or heard his father sigh under his breath. The worst part. The quiet. The way no one spoke about the future anymore. Before, conversations had been full of when you get the cart or once you start selling, but now, nothing. It was as if the dream had died, buried somewhere beneath the weight of his choices. And maybe it had. By the second evening, he could barely stand it anymore. After dinner, an awkward, tense meal where his mother didn't ask if he wanted seconds and his father barely acknowledged his presence, Cameron grabbed his jacket and stepped outside. The crisp night air hit his face, cool and sharp, a relief from the suffocating warmth of the house. He leaned against the railing of the small front porch, exhaling slowly. The neighborhood was quiet, the only sounds the distant hum of passing cars and the rustling of tree branches in the wind. He stared up at the sky, at the dull glow of the city beyond, feeling an exhaustion that had nothing to do with his body and everything to do with the weight on his shoulders. Then the rumble came. Deep. Heavy. A sound that didn't belong in a quiet residential street. His brows furrowed. The ground beneath him vibrated just slightly. Then headlights. Bright, unrelenting beams slicing through the darkness as a convoy of military vehicles rolled down the street. Cameron's breath hitched. His fingers curled around the railing, his heartbeat slamming into his ribs as the massive SUVs and armored transports came to a slow, precise stop directly in front of his house. From inside, he heard his mother gasp, the scrape of a chair against the floor, the sound of his father stepping toward the window. The neighborhood, which had been still and lifeless only moments ago, seemed to hold its breath. Then, the doors of the lead vehicle swung open, and he stepped out. General Marcus Caldwell. The man commanded the space around him without a single word. His uniform was pressed to perfection, the 4 silver stars gleaming against the dark fabric of his shoulders. His boots struck pavement with precise, measured steps as he approached the front of the house, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed on one thing. Cameron. The front door opened behind him. His father stepped out first, his mother hovering just inside the doorway, her hand pressed to her chest. His father, usually composed and steady, had gone still. His jaw clenched, his shoulders squared, but there was something uncertain in his posture, like he didn't quite know whether to be defensive or respectful. Cameron, however, could only stare. His pulse thundered in his ears as the general stopped 3 feet away from him, hands clasped behind his back, eyes sharp but not unkind. "Are you Cameron Bennett?" The question rang through the heavy night air, crisp and authoritative. Cameron swallowed hard, forcing his voice not to shake. "Yes, sir." For a moment, the general simply looked at him. Not in the way his father had, full of doubt and disappointment. Not in the way his mother had, with worry and heartbreak in her gaze. No, General Caldwell looked at him like he saw him. Like he knew. Then the general nodded once, a small but deliberate motion. "I came to thank you," he said, his voice steady, "on behalf of thousands of veterans across this country." Cameron felt his breath stutter. His father shifted beside him, his brow furrowing in confusion. His mother let out a soft, stunned sound behind them. "The veteran you helped 2 days ago, Robert Hayes, is one of the most respected men in our community," Caldwell continued. "A man who has given more than most. And thanks to your selflessness, he was able to get the care he needed. But that's not why I'm here." Cameron's fingers twitched at his sides. "Why are you here, sir?" The general reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a phone. He turned the screen toward Cameron. A picture stared back at him, his own face. It was the photo Robert had taken that day, right before they parted ways. Cameron swallowed hard as he read the caption beneath it. "This young man gave me everything he had so that I could get the medicine I needed. In a world that often turns its back on us, he reminded me that kindness still exists. If we don't lift up people like Cameron, then who are we?" Cameron's breath caught. His eyes flicked lower, and his stomach dropped. It had gone viral. Tens of thousands of shares, hundreds of thousands of likes. And below that comments. Thousands of them. People asking how they could support him. People demanding that someone help get him back on his feet. Organizations stepping in. Businesses offering resources. The general let him take it all in before speaking again. "You gave up everything you had to help someone else," he said, his voice quieter now, but no less powerful. "It's time for us to return the favor." Caldwell reached into his coat again, this time pulling out a sealed envelope. He extended it toward Cameron. Cameron hesitated, his fingers hovering over it before finally taking it with careful hands. Slowly, he lifted the flap and pulled out 2 things. A certificate. And a check. His breath hitched as his eyes scanned the words on the certificate. A full college scholarship. Everything. All tuition covered. His hands trembled as he looked down at the check beneath it. $15,000. More than enough. More than he ever dreamed of. His mother let out a sharp gasp. His father stiffened beside him, his eyes flicking between the check and Cameron's stunned expression. For the first time in 2 days, Cameron had no words. The general gave him a firm nod. "The veteran community came together to make this possible," he said, "because you reminded us that there are still people out there willing to do what's right, even when no one's watching." Cameron's chest felt too tight. His vision blurred slightly. He had given up everything. And somehow life had given it all back to him tenfold. His father let out a shaky breath, raking a hand over his face before muttering, "Damn." His mother pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes glistening as she whispered, "Cameron." But he barely heard them. Because in that moment, as the general gave him one last nod of respect, Cameron finally understood. Sometimes, when you give selflessly, the universe finds a way to give back. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.